Hey guys, tonight we're plunging deep into the strange, feathery heart of medieval Europe. The moon hangs low over moss-covered rooftops. Chimneys puff slow ribbons of smoke into the inky night. A rooster crows, not because the sun is rising, but because someone, somewhere, is trying to shake off a bad case of medieval shyness. Yes, really. You're wrapped in a woolen cloak, lantern swinging gently from your hand, boots squelching in cobbled mud. The town square is quiet, save for the occasional creak of a weathered sign or the bleating of a sleepy goat. And in the shadows, just past the tavern and the apothecary, stands a low-roofed cottage with a curious sound leaking from its thatched roof. Soft clucks, scratchings, and the occasional indignant squawk. Inside, the healer is awake. Not to mix herbs, not to chant prayers, but to tend to his rooster, a bird believed to cure the very ailment you've been too shy to confess to anyone. You, dear listener, are in for something bizarre. Bizarre and boring in the best possible way. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I always love seeing how far this little sleepy community stretches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together that you're not dreaming yet. You're simply drifting into the part of history most people never hear about. Not because it's secret, but because it's just so oddly boring. You've heard of holy relics, dragon slayers, and plagues, but tonight we're diving into the forgotten belief that a humble rooster could somehow chase away the heavy fog of human shyness. Of course, this wasn't about giving speeches or networking events. This was medieval shyness. The kind that might make you forget your prayers, dodge eye contact with a priest, or fail to ask a question during the town's one and only council meeting of the decade. Somewhere between superstition and sincere hope, people began associating the rooster with something more than mourning. The rooster was seen as a herald of light, courage, and, rather peculiarly, extroversion. You pass a sleeping cart horse, its breath fogging in the moonlight. On a low stone wall nearby, another rooster sleeps fitfully, one eye open like it's judging your posture. In a world where mirrors were rare and personal development books didn't exist, people looked to animals to explain and fix human behavior. And the rooster? Well, it crowed without shame, strutted like royalty, and faced danger with an audacity that would make a TikTok influencer blush. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were widely practiced or more isolated to superstitious fringes, as one particularly dry academic once put it. But the traces are there, in folk tales, monastic journals, and local court records that mention fines for improper keeping of curative poultry. The path leads you up a hill where a stone church perches like a sleepy hen on its nest. A rooster-shaped weather vane creaks gently in the breeze. You might not realize it, but those rooster weather vanes weren't just for decoration. They were often symbols of vigilance, moral and spiritual, and were believed to ward off evil, and perhaps timidity too. Down the hill again, you reach a village square where a faded wooden board still shows remnants of a once popular traveling remedy, the crowing cure. For 2 copper coins, the traveling confidence peddler would place a live rooster on your head, chant a rhyming verse, and urge the bird to crow. If it did, you'd be blessed with courage. If not, well, you'd just end up with bird poop in your hair and possibly a tetanus shot if you were lucky enough to live in the 20th century. And let's be honest, modern self-help books aren't much more effective than a gentle rain begins, softening the edges of the night. Your boots squish a little louder now, but the pace stays slow, steady. You're walking through a time when everything moved just a little more sluggishly. No one rushed to cure shyness. They simply observed, adapted, and sometimes, if they could afford it, bought a chicken. Did it work? Probably not. But neither does imagining your audience naked before a big speech, and people still swear by that trick. Back at the edge of the woods, an old woman is said to live with 7 roosters, each with a different emotional frequency. One for sadness, one for rage, one for bravery, and one, yes, one, for helping you speak your mind during the town's annual cheese tasting debate. Her cottage smells of hay, damp feathers, and something vaguely metallic. Some say she was a healer. Others said she was a witch. She preferred poultry psychologist. Her most famous client? A young monk who couldn't recite Mass in front of others. After 3 weeks of morning rooster therapy, he led the Easter procession, clutching a slightly confused but deeply respected bird. Now, as the sky brightens ever so slightly with the earliest hint of dawn, you realize this isn't just a walk through town. It's a slow descent into a belief system so sleepy, so feathered, and so quietly absurd that you might not even notice yourself slipping into dreams. That's fine. The rooster will keep watch. You're still walking. Past a crooked bakery where the sourdough has been rising since sunset. Past a shuttered tavern whose wooden sign swings like it's sighing in its sleep. The only sound now is your breath, the occasional drip from a thatched eave, and, you guessed it, that distant, strangely punctual cock-a-doodle-doo from somewhere behind a pigsty. The medieval world is still dozing, but you're on the trail of something curious. Not dangerous, not thrilling, just curious in that uniquely sleepy way, like realizing your sock is on inside out, but deciding not to fix it because, honestly, what's the point? Let's talk about the rooster itself. You know the type: glossy plumage, a comb like a red crown, and that slightly pompous gait like it's always late for a very important strut. Medieval people admired this bird's confidence, envied it, even. A rooster never blushed. A rooster didn't second-guess itself before crowing. A rooster did not, under any circumstances, avoid eye contact during a feast at SO. Naturally, someone, likely a peasant herbalist with a flair for drama, decided that if you were shy, you just needed a little rooster magic, and not metaphorical magic. Literal. Live chickens were involved. You trudged toward a clearing behind a monastery wall. Here, according to one scrap of parchment found in a 13th-century monk's journal, rooster therapy sessions were quietly conducted for those afflicted by speechlessness of the spirit. That's how they framed shyness. It wasn't a character trait. It was a spiritual blockage, like constipation, but for your personality. The sessions were simple. The shy person was asked to sit in silence while a rooster was placed on their lap or shoulder. No words were exchanged. The bird just sat there, judging, clucking, occasionally pecking at crumbs no one remembered spilling. The theory? The sheer absurdity of it would either embarrass the person into speaking or, miracle of miracles, the rooster would crow, symbolically releasing the emotional tension. Now, you're thinking, that sounds like a therapy chicken, not a therapist. And you wouldn't be wrong. Historians still debate whether these practices were formalized or merely local folklore, says one dusty footnote in an obscure Flemish dissertation. But the records, fragmented and fragile, do exist. They tell us of traveling bird charmers offering confidence sessions at spring fairs. For a small fee and a hunk of barley bread, they'd let a rooster perch on your arm and absorb your social hesitation. Some went further. Certain regions believed roosters could detect liars, cowards, and bashful frauds by the way they responded to human touch. If the rooster pecked you, you were secretly proud. If it nuzzled you, yes. Apparently that's a thing. You were pure of heart. If it flew off in terror, you were obviously a hopeless introvert and should consider living in a cave. You wander into one such fairground now, long abandoned. The hay has rotted to moss. The wooden stalls caved in like tired knees. But in your imagination, because that's where all the best boring history happens, the place is alive again. Children shriek with laughter, women in linen caps haggle over pickled radishes, and a man with a rooster on his head is yelling about self-esteem. He claims this bird is wholly touched, that it's helped over 36 people overcome the fear of public song. A nearby woman rolls her eyes and mutters something about snake oil and feathers, but 3 other people line up behind her anyway. Is any of this real? Possibly not. Or only half real. But in a world without psychology, without introversion quizzes or social anxiety diagnoses, people had to put their fear somewhere. And so, why not the rooster? You pass a tavern wall carved with a crude drawing, a stick figure bowing before a large, very judgmental chicken. Beneath it, in wobbly Latin, "He who fears, hears the rooster." Interpret that however you like. Inside, another cottage, now collapsed. An elderly woman once lived who claimed her rooster could speak to the timid in dreams. She swore he whispered bedtime affirmations. Others said she just muttered in her sleep. Either way, the village remembered her fondly, mostly because her rooster kept the foxes away and occasionally led the Sunday procession when the priest's donkey refused. Yes, that happened. No, it's not well documented. But you want to believe it, don't you? The air thickens with chimney smoke and dew. Your cloak gets heavier. The path slopes gently upward now, leading to a hilltop where an old bell tower leans like it's dozing. There's no one around, just you and the birds, silent now, as if waiting for you to pass. In some places, like the alpine valleys of southern Germany, people believe that simply hearing a rooster crow while thinking about someone you feared, speaking to, your lord, your crush, your landlord, would help you approach them the next day. This was known as Geflagellgist or poultry spirit, a word that sounds like a bad schnapps brand but once held genuine meaning. Scholars still argue whether this belief was pagan carryover or pure folk invention, says no one in a lecture hall because this topic rarely makes the syllabus. Still, here you are, plodding deeper into the feathers of forgotten faith. In the village of Lichfield, England, there's one record, written in maddeningly shaky script, of a boy who refused to speak for 7 years until a rooster leapt into his arms during Lent and crowed directly into his face. He shouted in surprise, then never shut up again. Coincidence? Perhaps. But try telling that to the nun who kept 2 roosters in her herb garden from then on, for the encouragement of bashful orphans. The belief wasn't just about shyness. As we understand it, it was about reticence, hesitation, the inability to claim space. And in a rigid society with fixed roles and few second chances, that hesitation could be costly. So they turned to what they knew, animals, not just for food or labor, but as emotional talismans. Some used cats to ward off nightmares. Others tied donkey hairs around their wrists for loyalty. And for shyness? The rooster got the job. You reach the crest of the hill now, where a single feather drifts by on the breeze that you're not sure where it came from, but you feel slightly more confident. The road beneath your feet turns to soft earth now, damp with dew and strewn with the occasional feather. Somewhere in the dark, a rooster rustles in a coop, perhaps sensing you, a fellow awkward soul searching for the secret to fearless small talk. Let's peel back another sleepy layer of this feathered folklore. Because to understand how roosters came to be considered therapy birds for the terminally bashful, you need to understand how medieval people viewed shyness in the first place. Today, you can say, I'm just introverted, and people nod like you've just completed a personality test on Instagram. But in the Middle Ages, things were different. There was no Myers-Briggs, no social battery discourse, no therapists scribbling in notebooks while sipping espresso. Instead, there was sin and silence that made people nervous. See, shyness wasn't just a social quirk. It had moral implications. If you refused to speak up, people might assume you were hiding something. Or worse, lacking in piety. Because what if your silence meant you didn't pray properly, didn't confess, didn't repent? One 12th century monk from Tours wrote in a marginal note, scratched in a mix of Latin and what could be stress-induced doodles, that the tongue is the servant of the soul. To lock it in silence is to deny one's place in the light. Now, that's a poetic way to say, speak up, or people will think you're dodgy. Historians still debate whether this was a widespread church position or just the opinion of one particularly dramatic monk with too much ink and not enough social outlets. But the idea lingered. Silence became suspect, especially in confession. Imagine this. You're kneeling on cold stone, palms sweaty, a priest waiting behind a carved screen. Your heart's pounding because last week you stole a goose egg and told your neighbor's wife she had the hair of a boiled onion. But the words won't come. Your tongue sticks. Your cheeks burn. You feel shy in today's world. You take a breath and try again. In the medieval world, they might call for the rooster. Yes, the rooster. Some monasteries reportedly kept roosters near the confessional booth. Not to listen, that'd be ridiculous, but to break the silence. Their crow was seen as a divine nudge, a little heavenly, a hymn, if you will. The idea was that the rooster, associated with vigilance and honesty, remember Peter denying Christ 3 times before the rooster crowed, could shake loose the truth from a reluctant soul. And if it worked, forgiveness flowed. And if not, at least you got a lovely poultry performance to distract you from eternal damnation. Point one story from a small village in Brittany tells of a local boy who couldn't confess his sins for fear of speaking to the stern, one-eyed Father Robert. So, the villagers brought in the confessional rooster, a fat, molting thing named Clovis. Clovis sat beside the boy, fluffed his feathers, and let out a truly offended crow. The boy, startled, blurted out his entire confession, plus some additional sins he hadn't even committed, just to be safe. People laughed, but from that day on, Clovis became a minor celebrity. He was bathed once a week, fed fig pastries, and eventually buried in a box lined with linen. His tombstone read, "He helped the tongue find truth." Now, whether this story is apocryphal or just the result of one too many fermented pear ciders, we'll never know. But even if it's folklore, it reflects something real, a deep need to break the quiet, in a world where being outspoken could get you burned for heresy, and being silent could get you labeled untrustworthy. The rooster walked. A delicate line. Bold, but not dangerous. Loud, but not rebellious. The ideal companion for those afraid to speak. You pass a crumbling chapel now, its steeple long collapsed, but a curious niche still holds a statue, worn nearly smooth by time. It's a rooster. Not majestic, not regal, just there, at peace, as if guarding the memory of all the awkward conversations it helped birth. Further down the lane, a cobbler's shop still stands, door barely hanging on. On the inside, someone once carved a tiny inscription, "Speak true." The rooster listens. Creepy? Maybe. Motivational? That depends on your tolerance for poultry-based peer pressure. But let's not forget that this belief in vocal chickens wasn't limited to religion. It filtered into village life, marriage rituals, even childhood lessons. Parents would tell their children, "Speak up, or the rooster won't like you." This, apparently, was a fate worse than chores in a few German-speaking regions. Parents encouraged shy children to feed the household rooster every morning. If the rooster accepted the food, the child would gain confidence. If not, well, better luck tomorrow. Of course, the child usually came bearing crusty bits of rye soaked in milk. The rooster, a simple creature, was just happy for breakfast. But, to a kid, that peck of approval meant everything. Scholars still argue whether this was ritualistic training or just good parenting disguised as superstition. Either way, it created a generation of children who genuinely believed that courage could be coaxed out with breadcrumbs and beady stares. The moon has dipped lower now. The clouds part just enough to let a shaft of silvery light illuminate the village square again. You pause. A single rooster crows, just once, from somewhere behind a shuttered window. You almost expect applause that you're not sure if it's calling you to action or just announcing that its internal clock is wildly off. But for a moment, you feel seen. A little ridiculous, maybe, but also bold. Not enough to give a speech, but enough to keep walking. You descend a slow bend in the road now, past the mossy remains of a crumbling boundary wall. In the distance, the rooftops of the village shimmer gently with moonlight, their chimneys poking up like crooked teeth. The night hums quietly around you, the kind of hush that makes even your thoughts tiptoe. But somewhere beneath that hush, like a thread pulled gently through cloth, is the memory of a cluck, a flutter, and the faint scrape of talons on stone to weave. Reached one of the most peculiar corners of this feathered folklore, the clucking confessional booth. You might think medieval people were humorless, but they weren't. They just wore itchy clothes and rarely smiled in portraits. Beneath all the incense and iconography was a human heart desperate to be heard. And sometimes, encouraged at so, how did a rooster end up near a priest's elbow during moments of sacred confession? Good question. Picture this, a cramped side chamber in a village church. The air is thick with candle smoke and damp limestone. A boy kneels awkwardly on a splintered bench, wringing his cap in his hands. He's terrified, not just of judgment, but of speaking at all. Behind the screen, the priest waits patiently. Then, instead of breaking the silence himself, he lifts a small wicker basket onto the table. Inside it, a rooster blinks. One loud crow. The boy flinches, and the words come pouring out. It sounds ridiculous now, but back then, it was just another way of coaxing a soul into expression. Some rural parishes even had designated confession roosters, birds raised specifically for their impressive timing and vocal skills. Not all priests used them, Of course, some thought it heretical or just too noisy. But in smaller communities, where superstition sat comfortably beside doctrine, it was an uncommon point. One particularly odd account comes from a chapel in northern France, where the rooster was said to have crowed only for the truly repentant. Whether this was divine judgment or just coincidence remains murky, but people believed it, and that was enough. Historians still debate whether these confession cocks were widespread practice or just colorful rumor. Some suggest they were used more symbolically, painted on walls, carved into wooden booths, or embroidered into vestments. Others claim live birds really were involved, at least in some parts of the countryside. What's certain is that roosters appeared frequently in art and architecture associated with vigilance and truth. If you've ever seen an old European church with a rooster-shaped finial or carving near the altar, you're looking at a symbol of spiritual watchfulness, and, just maybe, a nod to the old belief that boldness could be inspired by the boldest of birds. But back to our booth. In one tale from the Swiss Alps, a particularly quiet young man was said to have gone 3 years without speaking a full sentence. His mother brought him to a visiting friar known for unconventional methods. The friar, whose name was either Brother Anton or Brother Cockwhisperer, depending on who you asked, placed a plump rooster named Aloy in the boy's lap. The bird sat still, then crowed once. The boy blinked and muttered, "It's warm." Everyone gasped. A miracle, or poultry magic. Aloy, of course, became a local legend. He received fresh grain daily, a small cap during winter, and was reportedly buried in a miniature stone tomb with his own carved epitaph. It read, "He made the mute mumble." It's tempting to dismiss all this as medieval nonsense, and, frankly, much of it is. But there's something deeply human under the absurdity. In an age when emotions were either sinful or ignored, the rooster gave people a way to talk about fear without shame, to joke about it, to ritualize it, and eventually, to face it. Even the church couldn't completely ignore this strange feathered faith. In one 14th century bishop's letter, he warned that placing hope in birds instead of in Christ may lead the flock astray. But he also added, somewhat begrudgingly, that if a rooster does inspire a man to speak truth, then may it crow thrice. Passive-aggressive holiness at its finest. In other areas, the practice became slightly more theatrical. Traveling clerics, those religious figures who roamed the countryside like less musical troubadours, would sometimes carry a small rooster with them in a covered basket. At gatherings, especially during seasonal festivals, they would perform a ritual where the rooster was asked to judge the honesty of the assembled. If it crowed during a pause, people believed it was affirming the truth or calling out a lie. Imagine standing in a muddy field, hands clasped, hoping the bird doesn't single you out for emotional cowardice. Welcome to medieval team building. You wander now into a clearing where one such ritual may have taken place. The stones arranged in a haphazard circle. An old bench, half swallowed by moss. At the center, a crumbling stone pedestal, perhaps once the base of a statue. Or maybe just a convenient place to rest a basket of confidence chickens. That it's quiet here, but your thoughts make noise. You wonder how many people once stood in this very spot, clutching their secrets, hoping a bird would shout them free. And perhaps, sometimes, it worked. Not because the rooster was magical, but because people wanted to believe it was. The comfort of ritual, the thrill of unpredictability, the absurdity that made fear feel smaller. And isn't that what we still crave? Not solutions, necessarily, but symbols. Things to hold on to in the dark when our voices falter. Things that remind us it's okay to be nervous, okay to be unsure, okay to need a rooster every now and then. You walk on, the sky still cloaked in pre-dawn gray. A breeze stirs. Far off, another rooster crows. And though you're alone, you smile. You haven't said a word, but you feel heard. The path turns muddy again as you round the bend near a crooked fence that's seen better centuries. A slumping barn leans in the shadows, half swallowed by ivy, as if it's embarrassed to still be standing. Somewhere behind it, a rooster lets out a scratchy, uncertain crow, like it just remembered what day it is, but not what century. That we're deep in the countryside now, where medieval belief bloomed best, not in churches or castles, but in fields and kitchens, in baskets and broom closets. This is where the true feathered rituals of shyness played out. not as church doctrine, but as folk magic whispered between neighbors, passed from grandmother to child, and scrawled in the margins of cookbooks next to soup recipes that let's talk about feathers and folk magic in the fields. The average medieval villager. The rooster wasn't just a noisy alarm clock. It was a creature of mystery. It crowed at dawn, yes, but sometimes at dusk or in the middle of the night. It strutted like a lord, fought like a knight, and made absolutely no apologies for taking up space. You know, the exact opposite of someone with crippling social anxiety. Of course, people started to believe that feathers from this proud bird could somehow absorb, or even reverse, shyness. In rural France, for example, young girls were encouraged to wear small sachets around their necks containing a single rooster feather, a pinch of salt, and a dried violet petal. This, they believed, would give them the courage to speak during betrothal arrangements. Was this fashion-forward? Not particularly. Did it smell good? Also no, but it gave people hope. And when your social options include marrying a baker you've never spoken to or being sent to a nunnery, you cling to whatever hope you can stitch into a little fabric pouch. Point 1, particularly charming and slightly ridiculous practice came from the Carpathian Hills. There, young men who struggled to make eye contact were told to listen to the crowing of the neighbor's rooster every morning for 7 days, while holding a thistle and thinking of the girl they feared. If the rooster crowed after exactly 3 thistle pricks to the thumb, it was a sign that their fear would pass. Historians still argue whether this was a superstition or just a clever way to keep idle farm boys out of trouble for a week. Meanwhile, in the Scottish Highlands, a custom known as feather breathing involved holding a rooster feather under your tongue during communal gatherings to help untie the tongue. Unsurprisingly, this mostly led to coughing and an increase in people standing alone by the ale barrel, but even the failures were embraced. Because medieval folk magic wasn't about guaranteed results, it was about ritual. Doing something when you felt helpless. Believing that a creature so loud and assured could lend you a crumb of its courage. In hedgerow villages and market hamlets, mothers would tie rooster feathers into the hems of their children's cloaks. So they'll speak clearly, they'd say. And if the child still hid behind skirts and mumbled through their teeth, no one blamed the bird. They just added another feather. Or changed roosters. You pass a cluster of flat stones arranged in a circle, half submerged in moss. A folk tale from this region claims that shy children were brought here at dawn on Midsummer's Day and asked to name the birds they heard. If they could name 3 without stammering, their shy spirit would be banished. If they couldn't, they were given a small chick to raise, to learn from boldness daily. The saying went that it all sounds like playground folklore. But in an age where emotions weren't studied or medicated, but simply endured, these tiny, strange rituals offered structure. A way to name the unnameable. Point 1 of the quirkiest practices of all came from southern Italy, where farmers performed what was known as the crowing exchange. 2 neighbors would stand on opposite sides of a coop, each clutching a rooster feather. They'd shout a single word, any word, over the coop and wait. If the rooster crowed after the louder voice, that person was declared fearless. If it crowed for the quieter one, it meant true courage, though shy. If it didn't crow at all, they both had to carry water buckets for the village for a week, because clearly neither one was brave enough to inspire a chicken. The sheer absurdity of it is almost comforting, isn't it? These weren't cold clinical diagnoses. They were community theater. A little embarrassment, a little superstition, and just enough meaning to feel real. Even the quietest villagers could get swept up in it. Picture a cobbler who hadn't spoken above a whisper in years, agreeing, on a dare, to tuck a rooster feather in his boot before the town feast. That night, he stands up and tells a joke. Not a good one. Something about a goat and a miller. But people laugh. Not at the joke. At the miracle of hearing his voice that he never takes the feather out. And just like that, the legend grows. You pause beside a low stone wall. A faded carving near the base shows a rooster with wings outstretched, standing atop a pair of crossed shoes. It's probably meant to signify protection, but who's to say? Maybe someone once believed it helped shoemakers with stage fright. There are no manuals for this part of history, just fragments. A recipe for stew with a footnote about rooster bones to cure bashfulness. A farmer's ledger noting that the black-feathered one crows best for bravery. A child's drawing of a chicken with the word bold scribbled underneath their breadcrumbs. And like any good chicken, we're following them in the dark. You reach the edge of a field now, the stalks tall and soft with morning mist. Somewhere nearby, another rooster crows. Not the triumphant kind of crowing, more like a throat clearing. Still, it echoes across the field like a lazy trumpet. And you, muddy, quiet, and just a little less shy, keep walking. No feathers needed. Not. Tonight, you step carefully across a narrow footbridge, the wood groaning with age beneath your boots. Below, a trickle of water gurgles as if whispering secrets from some forgotten monastery kitchen. Beyond the stream, a path winds upward toward a low hill, where a ruined tower peeks out between the trees, its stones mottled with lichen, its windows dark, its roof long surrendered to time. But it's what waits inside that tower, or rather, what once did, that pulls you closer. Because tonight, you're not just chasing rumors of feathered fortune tellers. You're about to brush against parchment. Real parchment. Quill scribbled, soot-stained, deeply bizarre medieval writing that connects chicken behavior to the human soul. Yes, we've arrived at the scrolls, the codices, the borderline poultry-obsessed musings of monks, scholars, and chicken whisperers who wanted to make sense of human emotions by studying the barnyard. Welcome to Scholars, Scrolls, and the Chicken Code. Let's go back, way back, to a little-known manuscript housed in a minor Bavarian abbey in the 14th century. Catalogued as Codex DCCXLVI, because medieval monks couldn't resist a good Roman numeral. This curious scroll contained herbal recipes, weather predictions, and, tucked between a sermon about repentance and a complaint about turnip thieves, a treatise titled De Spiritu Gallinatio. Roughly translated, on the spirit of the rooster. The anonymous monk who penned this section, known only by his squirrel-shaped doodles in the margins, believed that roosters exhibited all the virtues a man ought to. He wrote, "The rooster riseth first, without prompting, and doth announce the light. He feareth not the wolf, nor doth he shrink before judgment. Such is the soul brave." And then, as if that weren't enough, should a man emulate the rooster in posture, gait, and voice, his cowardice shall flee. That's right. In the Middle Ages, someone literally suggested walking and shouting like a rooster to become less timid. Confidence, according to this deeply underqualified chicken psychologist, was a matter of avian mimicry. Historians still debate whether the monk was being serious or if he had just spent too many nights in the scriptorium breathing candle smoke. But the fact remains, the belief made it onto vellum. And it wasn't alone. In an equally obscure manuscript from northern Italy, a scholar named Pietro dell'Anima compiled a list of bird soul analogies, claiming that the rooster corresponded to the human vis voluntatis, the will. In his view, the rooster's unwavering daily crowing symbolized an inner force that overcame fear, hesitation, and social awkwardness most lamentable. Yes, even in the Renaissance, people were trying to write themselves out of being nervous to theirs. Even a brief mention in a 15th century treatise on dream interpretation that claimed, "To dream of a rooster in song is a sign that thou shalt overcome speechless dread." That sounds almost motivational, like something you'd slap on a mug in a sleepy Etsy store. Crow your truth, but not all these records were so poetic. Some were downright weird. One marginal note in a Danish legal codex warns that a man who walks with hunched shoulders and eyes low is said to lack rooster spirit. This line sparked a brief flurry of chicken-themed posture correction rituals, including one in which bashful boys were made to march behind a rooster with sticks tied to their arms so they'd strut proper. It worked about as well as you'd expect, which is to say, not at all. But everyone involved got a good laugh, and, in some cases, a broken fence. You step into the shell of the tower now. The wind whistles through the archways like a sigh. On one wall, just faint enough to miss in daylight, someone has carved a crude rooster, body lopsided, comb exaggerated, beak open in eternal crow. Beneath it, the Latin words, vocare est vincere. To speak is to conquer. Cheesy? Maybe, but imagine being a scribe, huddled in this cold chamber, squinting by candlelight, hoping that scratching a rooster into stone might banish the gnawing dread of speaking aloud in the refectory tomorrow. Not all who feared speaking feared God. Some feared the sound of their own voice in a quiet room. In a few monastic schools, novice monks were given rooster readings, little handwritten tracts that encouraged them to meditate on the bird's virtues. One even included a short script titled The Boldness of Beak, in which a fictional rooster teaches a timid farm boy to declare his love to a milkmaid. Was it good literature? Absolutely not. Did it include the line, "Let thy voice be as crowful as thy heart is full"? Yes, yes, it did. And yes, I know crowful isn't a real word. But neither was awkward turtle, and we still made that a thing. You step over a broken bench, then sit on a cool stone ledge. The stars above have shifted slightly, but the night still holds you in its velvety grip. Somewhere in the distance, another rooster makes a sleepy cluck, like it's winding up for a crow and then deciding, never mind. As ridiculous as these scrolls and scribbles may seem, they reflect a quiet truth. People have always searched for models of courage, not the sword-wielding, dragon-slaying kind, but the quiet courage of saying hello, of raising your hand, of standing when you'd rather melt. They found it in a bird that never whispered, a creature that made no apology for announcing its presence, loudly, daily, and on occasion, inconveniently. And in doing so, they found, however briefly, a feathered mirror for their own timid hearts. You rise, brushing dust from your cloak. The wind nudges you forward. The scrolls may be forgotten. The tower may be crumbling. But somewhere, deep in the crannies of history, a rooster still crows for courage. The hill slopes gently downward now, your boots finding firmer ground on a path dappled with moonlight. Crickets offer their usual sleepy chorus, and the grass sways with the sort of rhythm that makes you want to lie down and rethink every social interaction you've had since childhood. But don't worry, you're not alone in that feeling. In fact, medieval villagers had a whole system for dealing with personality quirks. And yes, once again, the rooster was right in the center of it. Tonight, you're entering the oddly romantic, if slightly judgmental, world of the pecking order of personality. In medieval Europe, matchmaking wasn't just about dowries and bloodlines. It was also about temperament. And when villagers didn't have the benefit of therapy sessions, dating apps, or those little quizzes that tell you what kind of bread you are, they turned to animals. Specifically, roosters. At harvest festivals or betrothal fairs, it was not uncommon for young people to be assessed, not by conversation, but by how they behaved around a rooster. No, seriously. One common ritual was known as the circle of courtship. The setup? A rooster was placed in the center of a chalked circle in the village square. The eligible young man or woman would enter the circle and attempt to approach the rooster. If the bird crowed, it meant the person was confident and true of heart. If it ran away, it was a sign of unresolved timidity. If it attacked, well, that meant passion, and perhaps a touch of poor impulse control. This wasn't just backyard nonsense. Some regions treated these displays with remarkable seriousness. A noble family in Bohemia was said to have annulled an engagement after the groom failed the crowing test, during which the rooster not only ran from him, but attempted to climb into the basket of a nearby merchant's daughter instead. Historians still argue whether these tests were symbolic courtly rituals or if people genuinely believed poultry could detect emotional compatibility. Notes one particularly tired-sounding academic footnote. But whether symbolic or sincere, the belief stuck. There was even a popular folktale from Flanders about a girl named Margot who could not speak above a whisper, until the day a traveling priest told her to keep a rooster feather under her tongue during meals. At the next village feast, she stood up, announced she was in love with the blacksmith, and promptly hiccuped for the next 3 hours. It wasn't elegant, but it was progress. In some areas, more elaborate rituals developed. In parts of Hungary, rooster circles were used in public matchmaking ceremonies. 2 roosters, one red, one white, would be placed in a ring. The red symbolized boldness, the white, kindness. Suitors had to declare which one best matched their nature. The wrong answer, depending on the mood of the crowd, could earn you laughter or admiration. People didn't just want to be loved. They wanted to be understood. And in the absence of language, they looked to the language of animals. Roosters were loud, proud, and full of symbolic meaning. A lesser-known and mildly uncomfortable practice from rural France involved the rooster blessing. Before a marriage proposal, the shy suitor would present a live rooster to the family of their intended. If the bird crowed within a minute, it was a sign that the match was blessed. If it did not, the suitor had to come back a week later, preferably with a more motivated rooster. Of course, the rooster could be bribed. A sprinkle of oats, a discreet elbow nudge. Some believed the birds responded to the suitor's voice. Others, more cynically, believed they just responded to food and proximity to female chickens. Either way, the tradition stood. You walk now. Along the edge of a stream, the moon reflecting soft white along its ripples. A small stone bench stands nearby, and etched faintly into the seat are two figures, side by side, and a rooster between them, wings outstretched. Above them, faded words, the brave crow before they kiss. It's oddly sweet, and a little sad, because behind the whimsy of these beliefs is a simple truth. People were terrified of rejection, of speaking up, of revealing their feelings. And they invented rituals, funny, awkward, earnest rituals, to make the vulnerable act of love feel less risky. In that way, not much has changed. You step through a wooden gate, the hinges groaning, like old men getting up from a bench. Beyond it lies what was once a festival field. The grass is uneven, a little too long, dotted with wildflowers. Here, once upon a time, young men danced poorly, young women pretended not to look, and roosters served as judges in the theater of human attraction. There's even a story from Wales where a local girl named Caris used to braid rooster feathers into her hair before dances. She was shy, rarely spoke, but the feathers gave her courage, or at least a reputation. The village boys began calling her Cockerel Caris, and one even wrote her a song that went something like, "She crows not, loud but crows she does, and draws more eyes than any buzz, the quiet hen, the fierce red plume, who fills the silent room with bloom." We're not sure if Caris found love, but her story lived on. And so did the belief that the rooster, brash and bright and unapologetically vocal, might somehow lend its courage to those of us who'd rather disappear into the wallpaper. You take a seat on the grass, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. There's a peace here, as if all the whispered confessions, the nervous giggles, and hopeful crowings still linger like perfume, and somewhere in the distance, just faint enough to question, a rooster calls out. Once, twice, then quiet again. You smile that you're not auditioning for love tonight. You're just listening, remembering, drifting, and the rooster, it's already judged you brave enough. The trees begin to thicken as you follow a winding trail down into a small wooded hollow. Overhead, moonlight flickers through the branches, in pale, dappled patches, like someone shaking flour across the forest floor. It's quiet here, thicker, somehow, as though even the birds are holding their breath. But you're not alone. Not in a place like this. This was the alchemist's domain. You approach the crumbled foundation of what might have once been a stone cottage or laboratory, or both, depending on how ambitious the resident was. A circular pit nearby, blackened with soot, suggests something once burned here regularly. Potions, metals, and if local lore is to be believed, roosters, yes. Welcome to one of the strangest chapters in this whole tale. A bird on the alchemist's table. You may be wondering, what on earth an alchemist, those eccentric blendings of scientist, philosopher, and pyromaniac, wanted with a chicken? Surely they had better things to do than pluck feathers or coax crows. Well, yes and no. In the Middle Ages, alchemy wasn't just about turning lead into gold. It was about transformation of all kinds, emotional, spiritual, even social. And, to some, shyness was a form of imbalance, a blockage in the humors, a flaw of will, something that could, theoretically, be purged. And that's where the rooster comes in. Some fringe alchemists believe that the rooster embodied the fire of will, that its internal organs, particularly the cordis galli, or rooster's heart, held properties that could instill courage, resolve, and confidence when properly prepared. Prepared how? Well, let's just say, you wouldn't want to be the rooster. Point 1 preserved recipe, found scribbled in a particularly alarming notebook from Prague, described drying the heart of a red, unmarried rooster under the midsummer sun, then grinding it to powder and mixing it into wine infused with lion's tooth, what we now call dandelion. The resulting concoction was to be drunk on the eve of great confrontation. Historians still debate whether this was a symbolic ritual or an early attempt at performance-enhancing emotional supplements. One traveling alchemist named Master Beranger claimed his special rooster potion had helped over 200 men overcome stammering, shyness, and the dampening of the heroic tongue. A popular side effect? Slight chest puffing and the uncontrollable desire to strut. Coincidence? Probably. But try telling that to Beranger's satisfied clientele. In certain port cities, sailors were said to carry rooster talismans when setting out on difficult negotiations. These weren't ordinary charms. They were often made from bone fragments sealed in wax, inscribed with phrases like vox audax, the bold voice, or canta, et vincus, sing, and you shall conquer. Whether they worked is unclear, but one sailor from a Genoese ship journal reported that his charm made him walk with greater purpose and speak without squeaking. We've all been there. Of course, the church wasn't thrilled about all this. Anything involving body parts, boiling, and vague emotional promises quickly raised ecclesiastical eyebrows. More than one alchemist was quietly discouraged or publicly punished for veering too close to what sounded suspiciously like folk sorcery. Still, the belief endured. One of the strangest preserved documents from this era is the Red Feather manuscript, a tattered collection of scrolls bound in goat leather. Among its more eccentric claims is this gem: to render thyself fearless in crowd or court, lay upon thine chest a poultice made from the foot of a rooster, crushed rowan berries, and the ash of thine own name writ and burned. Now, I'm not saying you should try this at your next job interview, but it's comforting to know that self-help hacks have always been weird. You sit for a moment on the moss-covered stone base of the ruined cottage. A small ceramic shard glints faintly beneath the dirt. On its surface, a faded feather pattern, scratched by hand. It might be nothing. It might be part of a bowl once used in some courage brewing ritual. Or it might have just belonged to someone who really liked chickens. Either way, it's a link. A whisper from a time when people ground up courage and drank it with honey. In some pockets of Europe, roosters were even used in transference rituals. A shy person would be asked to breathe onto the bird's back, then gently press their palm to its breast, as if depositing their timidity into the feathered vault. The bird would be released, and if it crowed while running away, it meant the transfer had worked. The shyness was gone. The bird had taken it. Now, did anyone ask the rooster how it felt about this emotional dumping? No, but ethics and animal-assisted therapy were loose. Back then, you stand again, brushing moss from your sleeve, and continue along the trail. Overhead, owls shift silently in the branches. The forest begins to thin, and as you step through a patch of wild thyme and bent nettle, you spot something ahead. A small cairn of stones. On the top, balanced carefully, a smooth wooden disc, etched with the symbol of a rooster and a rising sun. Could be a waymarker, or a memorial, or just someone's very specific garden decoration. But tonight, it's a sign. A reminder that people once turned to fire, feathers, and fantasy in pursuit of bravery. That they believed, with utter sincerity, that courage could be bottled, brewed, or borrowed from the proudest bird in the yard. And maybe, just maybe, that belief, absurd as it seems, made a difference. Even if the potion was mostly dandelion and wishful thinking, the path emerges from the trees now, opening into a sloping meadow quilted with dew. Each blade of grass glistens under the early touch of dawn, though the sky hasn't quite decided whether to blush pink or linger in its steely blue. Somewhere across the field, you hear it. A clear, resonant cock-a-doodle-doo. No hesitation, no embarrassment. Just certainty. The rooster has spoken. Again, and this time, it's not just a bird calling out into the void. It's part of the clock. You see, in the Middle Ages, people didn't wake up with alarms or sunrise apps or a gentle Spotify playlist. They woke with the rooster. But the morning crow wasn't just about timekeeping. For some, it was a signal, an emotional one. Because in this odd, sleepy pocket of medieval thought, many believed that when a rooster crowed, something inside you could shift. This is crow at dawn, confidence by noon. Here's how it worked. Imagine you're a timid baker. You've got a meeting today with the town reeve, a man who wears too much velvet and never blinks. You've been dreading it all week. So, you kneel beside your bed, mutter a prayer not just to God, but to your rooster. You ask it, silently, to crow at the right moment, just as the first light crests the hill. If it does, that's your sign. You will face the reeve. You will demand fair grain prices. You will not mumble, you lie back down. Wait, and then, caw-doodle-do.is. That divine timing? Pure coincidence? The product of a well-fed bird and an overactive imagination? Yes, all of the above. But it worked. Historians still debate whether these beliefs were deeply rooted in folk Christianity, pagan ritual carryovers, or simply the desperate hope of pre-coffee peasants. But in household journals and oral traditions, there are dozens of accounts of people timing their daily bravery by the rooster's crow, not unlike today's motivational tweets. Except with feathers and early morning manure that in some homes, roosters were even trained, kind of. Fed at dawn, coaxed to crow with little tricks. The goal wasn't accuracy. It was encouragement. The crow was a blessing, a green light, a psychological kick in the britches. Parents told shy children, if the rooster calls before you wake, your voice will be strong today. No pressure, right? Of course, not all roosters were compliant. One unfortunate record tells of a boy in Yorkshire who blamed his inability to recite psalms on a lazy rooster, who failed to crow for 3 days straight. His mother, scandalized, swapped the bird with a neighbor's. The new rooster crowed before sunrise the next morning. The boy spoke confidently at Massachusetts naturally. The rooster was fed cake and commemorated with a painting. The old rooster, meanwhile, was relocated to a less spiritually demanding barn. Then there were the skeptics, because yes, even in the 14th century, not everyone was on board with the idea of avian-inspired confidence. Some monks wrote scathing critiques of what they called temporal poultry superstition. One rather dramatic friar warned that placing fate in the crow is no better than bowing before a rutabaga. Harsh, but not entirely incorrect. Still, for every doubter, there were 5 believers. And the crowing rituals continued in some towns. Early risers would gather at the edge of the fields before a festival or important speech. They'd bring their household roosters in crates, line them up, and, at the first crow, shout their intentions for the day into the air. Picture it, a line of nervous apprentices, merchants, and would-be poets all mumbling hopeful declarations as a chorus of roosters yells in the background. A modern-day equivalents might include vision boards or chanting affirmations in your car before a job interview. Except this involved hay and maybe a small wager about which rooster would crow first. One humorous tale from Saxony tells of a mayoral candidate who lost the vote after his rooster crowed 2 minutes too late. Superstitious villagers claimed it was a sign of hesitant leadership. His opponent's rooster, a sleek white bird named Gottfried, crowed loudly and precisely as the church bell rang. The rest, as they say, is poultry-infused politics. But behind the jokes and the rituals was something quietly beautiful. People using nature as a clock for courage. When you didn't know if you'd speak up or ask the question or confess your love, you looked outside, waited for that crow, and told yourself, now. You go now. There's something deeply human in that. As you continue across the meadow, you come upon a low stone wall. It's nearly overgrown, but etched into its surface is a single word, audiat. Listen, you pause, and in the stillness, a rooster crows, clear and strong, from somewhere in the valley below. You don't need a ritual to know what it means, but just for tonight, you let it stand for something anyway. The meadow narrows into a winding lane now, hemmed in by overgrown hedgerows and gnarled hawthorn trees. Their twisted branches lean like gossiping old men, huddled in whispered stories about who did what with which feathered friend and whether it helped them speak in public. A breeze carries the faint scent of hay, damp wool, and, yes, chicken droppings. Not romantic, but real. You round a bend and see the outline of a stone structure rising from the fog. Modest, square, tucked behind a row of slumping beech trees. An old abbey, and here, within these walls long abandoned, the rooster became more than just a noise machine. It became a gatekeeper, a guide, a fluffy, flapping measuring stick of the soul. Welcome to Chickens and Cloisters. Quietly judging that we've already seen how roosters strayed into confessionals and courtyards, but the abbeys and monasteries. Oh, they took things a step further. These weren't just places of prayer. They were training grounds for spiritual warriors. And among those warriors were some profoundly anxious novices. Now imagine, you're 15, newly tonsured, awkward in your itchy robe. You've been sent to the abbey to study, to serve, to learn humility. You have to chant in Latin every morning, follow the rule of Saint Benedict to the letter, and, most terrifying of all, speak in front of the chapter house, public speaking, in front of monks, in Latin, on an empty stomach, somewhere around the 13th century. A few monasteries began incorporating a rooster ritual for novices who struggled with their voice or confidence. It wasn't standard across all orders, and historians still argue whether these were formally sanctioned or more like gentle pranks dressed up as mentorship. But the records exist. One abbey in what is now Western Germany reportedly kept a rooster, named Prior Plumage, who was allowed to wander the novice cloister freely. It was said that he had an uncanny sense for those monks in training who harbored deep anxieties. If he hopped into your lap during silent meditation, it meant you were wrestling with fear. If he pecked at your sandal, you were hiding guilt. If he ignored you entirely, well, you were either spiritually enlightened or just very boring. There's even a marginal note in a psalter from this region that reads, "He who the cock chooses shall speak first at chapter." Talk about pressure. One brother, Stephanus, was so terrified of this process that he tried to bribe the rooster with extra grain. It backfired spectacularly when the bird not only ignored him but hopped into the lap of the monk next to him, Brother Laurentius, who then gave a flawless reading of the Beatitudes and got promoted to cellarer within a month. Coincidence? Almost. Certainly. But in an environment where silence was sacred and speech was earned, the rooster offered something rare: external permission. If the bird blessed you, figuratively or literally, you were allowed to believe, just for a moment, that maybe your voice mattered. Another abbey, this one in northern England, kept a record of what they called Canticum Gallinaceum, or the Song of the Rooster. Novices preparing to take their first public vows were required to rise before dawn, stand in the courtyard barefoot, and wait. If the abbey's rooster crowed within 10 minutes of their arrival, it was deemed a sign that they were ready in voice and spirit. If not, they returned the next day. Monks were not known for their patience, so you can imagine the tension and the cold toes. One abbot wrote in his journal, "Brother Alric returned for 8 mornings before the crow. On the 9th, he stood tall. He spoke as one awakened." Did the rooster know? Probably not. But Brother Alric did. That's the point. Some took it further. In a Spanish Benedictine house, a shy novice was reportedly assigned the daily task of feeding the rooster and reciting psalms to it. After 2 weeks of this feathered audience, he was said to have delivered the best sermon the abbey had heard in years. Granted, the bar might have been low, but still, progressed out of course. Not all monks were thrilled with these practices. A stern Dominican friar once wrote, "Let not the voice of poultry decide what man should declare. Such jest befits taverns, not cloisters." Someone clearly didn't pass his own rooster trial. Still, the symbolism endured. Roosters appeared in stained glass, carved into pews, and even painted on the inside of novice cells. Not because monks loved chickens, necessarily, but because the rooster represented vigilance, clarity, and boldness in the face of the dark. And isn't that what speech is in its purest form? A small, defiant crow into the silence. You walk now through the remains of the cloister, stones slick with moss. The pillars cast long shadows beneath the moonlight, and you pause in the center where the rooster would have once been loosed to. Roamed at no feathers now. No soft clucks. Just the ghost of ritual, the echo of whispered prayers, and the knowledge that even the holiest men needed help finding their voice. The breeze stirs the weeds near a broken arch. You swear you hear a flutter. Probably a bird. Hopefully not symbolic. You move on, past the refectory and the sleeping quarters, until you reach a tiny alcove at the edge of the chapel ruins. There, etched into the stone by a long-dead hand, are the words, "Non vocavi solus." I did not call alone. You lean on the wall for a moment, letting the weight of that settle. Someone once believed their voice came from something more than themselves, and maybe, just maybe, that's how they found it. The path snakes along a ridge now, the view opening wide to show the patchwork fields below. The early hints of dawn are beginning to nudge at the horizon. just the faintest bloom of color, like someone dipped their paintbrush into peach and forgot to stop. Everything else is still hushed and grayed. As you walk, a faint shape appears. At the edge of the ridge, a stone chapel, long abandoned, its roof gone, but its arches still holding up like they're determined not to be forgotten. You step through the crooked doorframe and into a space where sermons once echoed, songs once rose, and, if you believe the paintings, roosters once preached alongside the saints. That's not sarcasm. Not entirely. Tonight, you've reached art, icons, and holy hens.in medieval religious art. The rooster wasn't just a farm animal lurking behind the stables. It was a symbol, rich with meaning. You already know about Peter and the denial, how the crowing rooster became shorthand for human weakness and redemption. But in many places, particularly between the 11th and 15th centuries, the rooster took on even broader symbolic roles. There are frescoes in forgotten Tuscan chapels where a rooster is perched beside saints like Catherine of Siena or Francis of Assisi. In some, it crows as a saint delivers a sermon. In others, it stands silently at their feet, haloed in gold, its gaze fixed forward as though listening with divine attentiveness. One particularly baffling manuscript from the Low Countries shows Saint Clare of Montefalco cradling a rooster in one arm while casting demons into a pit with the other. Scholars still debate whether this was meant to be symbolic or simply a case of confused iconography. Regardless, the association stuck in these paintings. The rooster represented not just vigilance, but truth spoken aloud. Think about it. The rooster doesn't crow silently. Its entire existence is based on declaring the arrival of something. Morning, danger, the baker's delivery wagon. And in that way, it mirrored what saints and preachers were supposed to do, to speak when others would remain silent. Some churches even included carved roosters on their pulpits. One English church in Sussex features a finely detailed rooster, crowing atop a scroll. The accompanying inscription reads, "Let the meek speak as the cock doth at dawn." A poetic way of saying, even if you're shy, speak up. Even if your voice cracks, say it anyway. And then there were the processions.is. The rooster parades.in some villages, particularly during Michaelmas or local saints' feast days, a symbolic rooster, sometimes carved, sometimes disturbingly lifelike, would be paraded through the streets. Children carried feathers. Elders wore pins shaped like tiny combs. The boldest among them would recite verses or shout blessings into the crowd, mimicking the rooster's call. It was a celebration of voice, joyful, ridiculous, and surprisingly moving. One popular chant went like this: "The rooster calls, so call. I too, not from pride, but to speak what's true. Feather, foot, and crowing tongue. Bold are we, both old and young." Not exactly Shakespeare, but in the right rhythm, with the right drumbeat and enough mulled cider, it could stir a crowd.in. Stained glass windows. The rooster often stood beside the cross, not just as a symbol of betrayal. Poor Peter never caught a break, but as a sign of awakening. Some even argued that the rooster represented the voice of the faithful. Its call, a miniature sermon before breakfast. You pause now beneath one such window, shattered, mostly, but still beautiful. A shard catches the light, a patch of red comb, a single golden eye. You wonder who painted it. A monk with calloused fingers and too many sleepless nights, maybe. Or an artist who'd once lost their nerve and found it again in the memory of a crowing bird. Even outside religious circles, the rooster bled into secular art. Marginalia, those whimsical doodles in the margins of medieval books, frequently featured roosters strutting through scenes of royal court, justs, even weddings. One famously cheeky manuscript shows a rooster pushing a timid knight into a moat with the caption, "When the heart is weak, borrow a beak." Another, less charming but equally fascinating image depicts a rooster lecturing a group of bashful scribes. One scribe appears to be weeping quietly into his inkpot. The rooster looks smug. Honestly, same energy as a TED Talk on finding your inner voice, but with more feathers. These visual jokes weren't just meant to amuse. They reminded readers, especially monks and students, that voice mattered. That silence might be comfortable, but it couldn't shape the world. One final curiosity. In the Cathedral of Chartres, tucked into a stone relief barely the size of your hand, is a rooster perched atop a book. It's hard to see unless you know where to look, and many visitors walk right past. But if you do spot it, you'll see the inscription below, E.T. Clamavit, come fight. He cried out with faith, simple, bold, and just a little ridiculous, like everything in this strange, sleepy journey. You step back into the open air now, the wind cool on your face. The chapel fades behind you, and you imagine the murals it once held, wings, halos, beaks, and all, because to the medieval mind, the rooster wasn't just a bird. It was a teacher, a voice when others fell silent, a slightly judgmental, occasionally violent, always punctual feathered saint. And tonight, as your own voice curls into quiet, the rooster watches, not to judge, but to remind, even the quietest soul can still find a moment to crow that you're descending again now, the trail soft with fallen leaves. The distant hum of a sleeping village stirs on the edge of the breeze, faint snoring from windows left cracked open, the low rustle of pigs adjusting in their pens, and somewhere, a rooster shifting its weight on a rooftop beam, preparing to do what it does best. But before that next triumphant caw, we take a sharp turn. Because while the rooster was often treated as a symbol of courage, truth, and holy vigilance, there were less flattering moments, less peaceful ones, occasionally downright theatrical. Tonight, we peek into the blush that betrayed the court, where roosters weren't just confidence coaches, but judges in very public trials of embarrassment that, let's be honest, medieval courts were not exactly subtle when it came to public spectacle. Whether you were being knighted, punished, or introduced to your betrothed while still covered in pig dung from your morning chores, someone was probably watching. And when it came to shyness, the noble courts had a particularly dramatic way of dealing with it. In several courtly traditions, especially in parts of Burgundy, Navarre, and bits of southern Germany, there existed a custom of using roosters in ceremonial honor challenges. Not for duel-worthy offenses, but for the social failings of court life, being overly timid, failing to speak during a toast, or, heaven forbid, stammering in front of the duchess. These rituals were known by many names: the rooster rebuke, the trial of crowing, or, in one record simply, shaming. By chicken, let's walk through one. Imagine a noble banquet, torches flickering along the stone walls, goblets clinking, a fire blazing in a grand hearth. The guests laugh, drink, tell bold tales. And then, young Sir Aldrich of somewhere important is called upon to give a toast to the visiting princess. He rises, mouth dry, hands trembling, and freezes. He mumbles. He blushes. He sits down before saying a full sentence. Cue the rooster. A servant appears, carrying a live bird in his arms, plump, red-combed, radiating self-importance. The bird is set on the table in front of Aldrich. If it crows, it means Aldrich's embarrassment has been acknowledged, and, according to tradition, he is now cleansed. If it does not, he is expected to wear a feathered cap of penance until the rooster finally crows in his presence. Sometimes for days, sometimes during mealtimes, sometimes during naps. Historians still argue whether this was sincere social correction or aristocratic hazing, writes one scholar who clearly never had to give a speech in front of snickering relatives. And yes, it gets weirder. If there's a documented event at the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine in which a young troubadour was forced to serenade a rooster after failing to properly flatter a noble lady during a performance. His song included the lines, "O feathered sage of sunlit morn, grant me strength, though I'm forlorn. With every crow, my shame shall fade, so I may sing unafraid." It did not rhyme well in Occident either, but it worked. The rooster crowed. The court laughed, and the young man reportedly became one of Eleanor's favorites, not for his music, but for his humility and good humor. In some instances, the rooster was not the final judge, but the starting whistle. During winter feasts, young nobles known for excessive shyness were brought forward in a mock tribunal. A rooster, perched nearby, would crow. That was the cue for them to defend themselves with voice, a speech, a poem, or even a confession of affection. Those who succeeded were applauded. Those who froze, well, they might be gently pelted with breadcrumbs. It wasn't Game of Thrones, but it had its moments. One noblewoman, Lady Baird of Liège, was known for turning these rituals into matchmaking opportunities. She would orchestrate elaborate shyness duels between young lords and ladies, placing a rooster between them as a kind of feathery cupid. Whoever the bird crowed toward was deemed ready for love. It was all ridiculous and incredibly popular. You wander now past a small manor house, long crumbled into ivy. On the lintel above the old stone doorway, a faint carving remains, two figures facing one another, with a rooster perched between them like an overly involved chaperone. Beneath it, he who cannot crow must speak. Even outside the nobility, the tradition trickled down. In village gatherings, weddings, and solstice celebrations, shy individuals were sometimes ceremonially gifted a rooster for the evening. They had to carry it, talk to it, or, even more absurdly, listen to it and mimic its call as part of a confidence game. It sounds humiliating now, but to them, it was a way to laugh at themselves, to nudge each other out of their shells, to say, "You're not alone in your awkwardness." And that's what these rituals really did. They turned fear into farce. They took the sting out of embarrassment. And while they weren't always kind, they often ended in laughter and the strange, sincere belief that a little bit of poultry-based theater could make a person braver. You pass an old fountain now, long dry. Carved into its base, a rooster mid-strut, chest puffed out, wings halfway raised. It's stylized, exaggerated, almost cartoonish. And still, it's proud, loud, present. You sit at its edge, fingers tracing the worn stone, imagining the voices that once filled this place. Some confident, some trembling, all human, and maybe, just maybe, all helped along by one slightly smug bird. The sun is threatening to rise now. Not with urgency. This is medieval dawn, after all, but with a slow, syrupy pour of light over the horizon, tinting the world gold and lavender. You tread softly past the fountain's rim and onto a mossy trail between two low hedgerows. Somewhere, nearby, a rooster clears its throat. The world is stretching, waking, and so too, we stretch into one of the more peculiar and unsettling branches of this feathered saga. Rooster trials and birdly blame. Yes, you read that right. There were actual trials for roosters, some for theft, some for public disruption, and at least one, possibly more, for contributing to fatal shyness that it's the Middle Ages, friend. People put eels on trial, pigs, even a few chestnuts. You think a rooster escaped the docket? Please. The most infamous case comes from 1386 in a village near Lausanne, Switzerland. A record from the town archives, half legible, half suspect, describes the trial of a rooster accused of causing the death of a youth through the burden of silence. The story goes like this. A boy named Henri had not spoken in 3 years. The villagers believed he was cursed or simply lost within himself. Then, one Sunday, he was seated near the village rooster during Mass. The rooster crowed, suddenly, sharply, right during the homily. Henri leapt to his feet in panic and dropped dead of fright. Not exactly an inspirational comeback. The villagers, scandalized, brought the rooster to trial. The charges? Witchcraft. Inducing deadly silence. Complicity in emotional possession. Now, was this a farce? A public drama? A method of emotional processing in a grief-stricken community? Historians still argue whether it was metaphor that got out of hand, or an early precursor to blame the bird's psychology. The court was presided over by the local reeve, who, according to a chronicler with a flair for the dramatic, questioned the rooster, then offered it grain, which it refused, suggesting guilt. Based on this very scientific method, the rooster was declared culpable of silence magic and sentenced to symbolic exile. Symbolic because it was just released into the forest. No beheading, no pillory, just banishment. What a relief, honestly. But this wasn't an isolated case in parts of eastern France, especially during the height of rural superstition in the 14th and 15th centuries. Roosters were viewed with both reverence and suspicion. Most households kept one, but should it crow at an odd hour, during a funeral, or while facing a mirror, it was believed to be a sign of twin spirit interference. Meaning, the rooster was sensing something otherworldly. If someone in the household grew unusually quiet around the same time, the rooster became the scapegoat, accused of absorbing the person's voice, taking their courage, hoarding their verba interna. their inner words, and once accused, the rooster faced trial in reality. Most of these were nothing more than public rituals. The rooster would be placed in the town square, surrounded by a circle of stones. Someone would read a prepared statement, sometimes in rhyme, accusing it of hoarding voice. The villagers would watch. Then, either the bird would crow, absolved, or it wouldn't. Shunned. No actual punishment followed. But the ritual mattered. Point one particularly touching tale comes from a village in the Rhineland where a mute girl, Greta, had never spoken aloud. After a local festival where a rooster had been ceremonially blamed for her silence, the bird was to be sent away. But Greta ran forward, wrapped her arms around the bird, and cried, "No." Her first word. The villagers, stunned, wept. The rooster became a symbol of miracles. It lived out its days in the churchyard, occasionally being dressed in garlands and fed pastries. Not a bad retirement for a falsely accused bird, of course. Not every trial ended so sweetly. In the darker pockets of superstition, some roosters were believed to be familiars, demonic companions sent to sabotage the timid, to clip the tongue of man. There are scattered accounts, many likely exaggerated, of roosters being burned, drowned, or ritually banished for stunting the spirit. It's disturbing and, honestly, deeply sad, because at its heart, this was fear. Fear of silence, of things left unsaid, of watching someone disappear into themselves and not knowing how to reach them. So they reached for what they understood, a creature that crowed, loudly and confidently. And when that creature seemed to fail, they panicked. They blamed. There's a small churchyard ahead. A crooked stone wall surrounds a patch of half-forgotten graves. One headstone stands out, not for its size, but for its carving. A rooster, wings half-lifted, eyes wide. Beneath it, in worn script, for those who found their voice too late. You stand for a moment, the breeze tugging gently at your cloak. Somewhere beyond the hedge, a rooster begins to crow. It's not loud. It's not triumphant. Just steady, like a whisper that knows it'll be heard eventually, and maybe that's enough. Tonight, you haven't come to judge, just to remember, to witness, even the strange trials, even the shame, because behind it all was the same hope that someday someone would speak. That silence, no matter how heavy, wasn't permanent, and if it took a rooster to believe that, so be it. A haze of light stretches thinly over the hills now, chasing away the heavier shadows. The sky has taken on the soft color of pearl, and the trees begin to wear gold around their edges. You step carefully through low grass, dew dampening your boots, as a village bell begins to toll. Just once, slowly, and beneath that bell, tucked into the corner of a sloped field behind a chapel ruin, lies a small, wooden platform, weather-warped, leaning, empty now. But once, it was a stage. You've reached a forgotten crossroad between folklore, fear, and theater. The stage wasn't for actors. Not quite. It was for banishers of demons, and shyness, and stage fright. Yes, tonight's tale takes you into the peculiar and surprisingly popular belief that roosters could not only scare off evil spirits, but also save you from the pure, undiluted terror of public speaking. Welcome to Crowing Against Demons and Stage Fright. That in many rural parts of Europe, particularly the Alps, the Carpathians, and the fog-thick reaches of northern England, the rooster was believed to be a creature that saw what others could not. Spirits, wraiths, invisible, dangers, and just as importantly, inner demons, not metaphorical ones, necessarily. Real ones, at least, as real as anything people feared enough to invent rituals for, and one of the most commonly feared possessions. You guessed it, an affliction of the tongue. That awful paralysis before speaking, the dry mouth, the red ears, the inexplicable desire to melt into your boots when asked to recite your name. People didn't call it social anxiety, of course. They called it the clutch of the silent specter, or the binding of the inner throat. Charming, really. And the solution? Sometimes, it was a rooster exorcism. Here's how it worked. The young squire of Marlin was dared to kiss the rooster. He trembled, then leaned forward and did so. The bird did not peck. The room roared. He was thence called Beakerbold, and the next day he made speech at court without a stammer. Beakerbold. Honestly, kind of iconic. Sometimes, the ritual involved more than just kissing. In parts of Bohemia, The rooster was placed on a high stool in the center of the tavern, and the shy knight had to deliver a toast, not to the room, but to the rooster. If the bird crowed during the speech, it was believed the speaker had awoken their true tongue. If it didn't, the speaker was heckled affectionately and required to try again after one more mug of ale. In other variations, the rooster would be made to judge two speakers. Each would recite a short boast, exaggerated tales of dragon fights, river crossings, or romantic successes, and whichever tale made the rooster crow was declared truest, or at least most entertaining. Was the bird trained? Fed at specific intervals? Possibly. Was it magic? Probably not. But did it help people believe they were capable of speaking boldly? Absolutely. And isn't that the point? You walk now through the old tavern site. The floor is mostly stone, with patches of moss where the roof gave up. In one corner, a ring of darker rock suggests where the hearth once roared. Beside it, faintly etched into the base of a pillar, a chicken wearing what appears to be a crown, and beside it, the words, "He who fears no beak, fears no crowd." It's silly, completely absurd, and yet kind of profound. These weren't knights slaying monsters. They were young men, terrified of speaking in front of strangers, terrified of being laughed at, of being ignored, of being seen. So they kissed a rooster, and somehow that made the fear smaller. In a world without microphones, without therapy, without the words to explain social anxiety, people found meaning in ritual. Even feathered ones, especially feathered ones. You sit on the old hearthstone for a moment, breathing in the cool morning air. Somewhere, a rooster calls out, not too far, not too urgent, just loud enough to remind you that morning is here, and voice is possible. You don't have to kiss a bird tonight, but if you did, you'd probably pass. The sun is a whisper now, just brushing the horizon with soft gold. Everything feels quieter than before, not with absence, but with anticipation. A rooster crows again, this one sharp and quick, as if declaring, "I told you so." You follow a trail that once served as a main road, though now it's only a suggestion of one, leading toward a cluster of half-collapsed cottages. The stones are old, but not ancient, just weather-worn. These aren't the dwellings of monks or nobles. These were homes for the ordinary, the sick, the quarantined. Because now, we're walking into one of the darker chapters of this already peculiar story, plague-time poultry psychology. Yes, even during the Black Death, roosters found a job that it's easy to forget, from the safety of our cozy, disinfected world, just how much nothing made sense in the 14th century. When the plague came, first in waves, then in tsunamis, people scrambled for meaning. Any meaning. And in many places, the rooster became a beacon, not just of dawn, but of mental survival. When whole households were isolated, shut in with red crosses on the doors and food left at the threshold, silence crept in like smoke. And with it, the worst kind of shyness, the silence born of fear, uncertainty, and grief. In those days, villagers believed that a rooster's crow was not just a reminder of mourning. It was a spiritual tether to the living world. Something brave, reassuring, unapologetic. In plague-stricken towns, people would keep roosters inside their homes, not for meat, not for eggs, but for their voices. One midwife's journal from Avignon reads, "The boy would not speak for 7 days. His mother, in panic, placed a cockerel beneath his cot. At sunrise, it cried. The boy followed. A miracle, she wept." Historians still debate whether this was an isolated tale or part of a broader coping mechanism, but we see similar accounts. Across Europe, in cramped rooms, fevered air, and the stench of sickness, people believed the rooster could cut through dread. And, oddly enough, it worked. In cities like Milan and Lubeck, wealthier households hired musicians to play outside, infected homes to lift the spirit. But in rural villages, roosters did the job. In some towns, particularly in the foothills of the Alps, it was customary to gift a rooster to families placed under quarantine. A young boy or girl would arrive at the threshold with a small crate. Inside, a rooster, usually red or white, colors associated with protection. Alongside it, a handwritten verse, "Crow for the fearful, crow for the weak. Your voice is the strength they dare not speak." The logic was not entirely foolish. In a time before doctors, before understanding germ theory, people turned to symbols. And the rooster, as always, was loud, proud, and miraculously unafraid, even when no one else dared make a sound. A person, usually young, often a student or a novice monk, was said to be haunted by a spirit that sat upon their tongue and sucked away their voice. The remedy wasn't holy water. It wasn't shouting "speak louder" into their ear. It was placing a rooster nearby and waiting for it to crow, because the rooster, they believed, had the power to shatter silence. Not just physical silence, but spiritual. Its crow wasn't just sound, it was light-made noise. A banishment, a signal to the demons of hesitation that their lease was up. Some records describe the afflicted being brought to a stone bench outside the church, where a rooster would be tethered nearby. The priest would say a prayer, and then everyone would just wait. If the rooster crowed, deliverance. If not, they tried again tomorrow. In village squares, it became something of a public spectacle. A youth too scared to sing at the spring festival, bring out the rooster. A woman too nervous to read the harvest poem, call for the crow of courage. People would gather, mutter encouragement, and lean in to hear not the person's voice, but the bird's. There's even a tale from the Black Forest where a quiet woodcutter named Jacob was too terrified to deliver his marriage proposal. The village healer placed a rooster under his cloak, yes, inside it, before he approached the woman. When he tried to speak and froze, the rooster squawked angrily against his ribs. She laughed. He stammered something resembling a proposal. She accepted. They later named their son Gallus, Latin for rooster. Obviously, scholars still argue whether these rituals were sincere religious practices, local performance art, or just really weird therapy. But they were widespread. And not just for individuals. Entire choirs were sometimes subjected to rooster rituals before big church services. A rooster would be brought into rehearsal and placed on a central perch. If it crowed within 3 psalms, the choir was purified of fear. If not, they had to repeat the rehearsal until it did. One traveling priest even claimed to carry a blessed rooster, whose crows were proof of heavenly readiness. His record? 12 exorcisms of stage fright in 1 week. Also a fair amount of chicken droppings on the cathedral floors. Not everyone approved. A bishop in Aragon once banned all poultry from cathedral grounds after one too many interruptions during his sermons. And one rather salty abbot wrote, "If thou need feathers to find thy voice, perhaps it should remain buried." Harsh, but for every skeptic, there were 2 believers, and probably at least 1 child desperately whispering encouragement to a grumpy hen in a box. The belief even reached the courts. In noble households, a guest too shy to present their toast could request a crowing pardon, a moment of pause in which a servant would produce a small rooster from a covered basket. If it crowed, the guest was considered absolved of their silence. If not, they had to recite a poem written entirely in rhyming couplets. One awkward poet never recovered. You arrive now at the platform. It's barely standing, its boards softened by years of rain and wind. But you can still see where people once stood, scuff marks, a cracked stone bench nearby, and the faded groove where a rooster's crate might have rested. There's a quiet here. Not the oppressive kind, the kind that holds memory, of voices coaxed out by crows, of fear turned to laughter, of rituals that felt silly but somehow worked. Because what is stage fright, if not a kind of haunting? And what is a rooster if not a strange, feathered exorcist with perfect timing? You sit at the edge of the platform, letting your feet dangle. The breeze ruffles the grass. And somewhere, not far, not close, a rooster crows, not to ward off demons, not to judge your silence, just to say, I'm here, I'm loud, and you can be too. The trail now winds into a drier patch of land, rocky, uneven, scattered with the shattered bones of old inns, forgotten way stations, and ancient tavern floors where boots stomped, mugs clanked, and confidence was, more often than not, liquid. But sometimes, it came feathered. You reach the edge of what was once a roadside tavern. The sign is long gone, but 2 posts remain, one still charred black at the tip. You can almost hear the echoes, slurred toasts, lute strings plucking off key, and somewhere amidst it all, a chicken. Because tonight, dear listener, we're pulling up a stool for one of the rowdiest and most eyebrow-raising Rituals in this already feather-heavy journey. The tavern test of tongue-tied nights. Yes. Nights. In taverns. Being judged. By roosters. Before you ask. Yes, it was real. Well, real enough to have left behind more than a few ink-stained mentions in travel journals and court records. A handful of deeply amused scribes took note of a tradition in certain taverns across Germany, Flanders, and parts of Poland, where young knights, especially those known for being quiet, shy, or less than valorous in the realm of flirtation, were subjected to what was lovingly called the rooster test. The rules? Simple. You, the knight, had to prove your mettle not with swordplay, but with social bravery. And the first step? Kissing a rooster. Yes, kissing. On the beak. Or, depending on local variants, on the comb. Either way, feathers were involved. Here's the setup. A tavern, usually one with a bit of a theatrical streak, would keep a challenge rooster. This was not an ordinary barnyard bird. No, this was a veteran. A seasoned, beer-hardened, possibly slightly enchanted fowl who had, by all accounts, seen things. He was kept in a box behind the bar, fed on kitchen scraps, and only brought out during particularly festive nights when shy knights were either peer-pressured or self-aware enough to volunteer. The test? If you could kiss the rooster, firmly, respectfully, and without flinching, you were deemed brave. A voice. If you hesitated, pulled away, or, heaven forbid, got pecked and yelped, the rooster would crow, loudly, and you would be declared cockerel cursed. The consequences were usually light: a round of ale bought for the house, a requirement to sing a ballad, or, if you were truly unlucky, a feathered cap you had to wear for the rest of the night. Historians still debate whether this was sincere ritual or elaborate barroom comedy. And honestly, it was probably both. Because while it sounds ridiculous, it served a function. It gave young knights, who were often expected to be bold, brash, and eloquent, a safe space to laugh at their own hesitation. And let's not forget, taverns were more than just drinking holes. They were social arenas, business meetings, marriage markets, places where being tongue-tied could cost you land, favor, or worse, your pride. So why not practice courage with a bird? There's one well-preserved account from a merchant named Ulrich, who traveled through Saxony in the late 1400s. He wrote, "You pass one cottage now, its doorway still standing, though the walls have bowed inward like tired shoulders. Near the base, in the faded plaster, someone etched a rooster mid-crow. Above it, a name, Elsbeth, age 11. No date, just the mark. Perhaps she lived. Perhaps the bird helped. Or perhaps her family just needed something to believe in." There were darker moments. Of course, in some villages, silence itself became an enemy. Families who stopped speaking were said to be spirit-stunned, vulnerable to death, not just from illness, but from emotional collapse. To counteract it, desperate neighbors would bring a rooster to the window and try to coax it into crowing, believing the sound could wake the house. One chilling tale from Kent tells of a woman who stood outside her sister's quarantine cottage each morning, rooster in arms, whispering prayers. The bird crowed on the third day. Her sister opened the door on the fourth. Coincidence? Hope? Folklore? All three. All tangled. And yet, there were limits. In some towns, superstition tipped too far, and people began to believe that a rooster's silence foretold death. If the bird didn't crow at dawn, panic set in. People banged pots, clapped, tried to provoke the animal into sound, as if the noise itself could shield them. In these moments, the rooster wasn't just a barnyard animal, it was a psychological life raft. A crude little play performed in a Czech village, one of the few bits of plague-era satire that survives. A character named Crispus the Coward tries to avoid the plague by locking himself in with two things: a Bible and a rooster. When the bird stops crowing, Crispus panics, loses his voice, and ultimately, his pants. The play ends with a surprise song and the rooster pecking Crispus on the nose. Even in tragedy, people clung to absurdity. Because absurdity meant life. As dawn begins to spread like melted butter over the hills, you pause near the last of the cottages. A broken chair leans against a wall. On its back is carved a familiar shape, a rooster, head tilted upward. It's small, barely visible, but you notice it, and you wonder, how many people, locked away with their grief, waited for a crow to remind them they were still here. And how many whispered their fears into feathers, hoping the bird would carry them out into the waking world? You keep walking, the sun warming your shoulders now. No plagues tonight, just memories, and the comfort of a creature too stubborn to stay silent. The morning has officially arrived now. Not just a whisper, but a gentle conversation of light and warmth brushing the tops of trees, coaxing color back into the landscape. You're no longer cloaked entirely in shadow, but you don't feel rushed either. The world is yawning, not shouting. As you walk between two stone fences, you spot a garden overgrown with thistle and mint, its gate hanging from one hinge. Beyond it sits a half-buried cottage foundation, the kind of place that might have belonged to a hedge witch, a lonely widow, or someone in need of protection from their own quiet heart. Because tonight, or rather, this soft-edged morning, we're stepping into the intimate world of superstition. Specifically, chicken bones beneath the bed. Yes, people once believed that sleeping near rooster bones could give you confidence, could cure your shyness, could bring you dreams filled with answers you were too afraid to ask while awake. A little creepy? Sure, but also deeply human. Let's begin in southern France, where, in the 15th century, it was common practice in certain villages to keep a pouch under one's pillow. Inside, a tiny chicken bone, specifically from the leg or breast of a rooster that had crowed 3 times at dawn on a saint's feast day. That's quite specific and quite difficult to verify, which naturally made it far more valuable. These bones were called lucid bones, not because they glowed, though some stories claimed they did under moonlight, but because they were believed to clear the fog of the tongue. You weren't supposed to talk to the bone. You weren't supposed to make a wish. You just had to sleep with it nearby, and if you were lucky, the next day you'd wake up and, for once, be able to say what you meant, to answer the question, to stand and speak at a gathering, to tell someone you love them. Historians still debate whether this practice came from older pagan rituals or was born entirely from village imagination. But one thing is clear, it spread. In parts of Bavaria, the ritual became more elaborate. There, the practice was known as der Mutterchen, the courage bone. Parents gave one to their children before the child's first day of labor or before meeting potential spouses. The bone had to be wrapped in blue cloth and placed beneath the left corner of the bed. If the sleeper dreamed of a crowing rooster, they would find their voice the next morning. If not, the bone was considered sleepy and had to be buried under a yew tree until it awoke. You really can't make this up. A folk rhyme from the region even survives. Beneath the bed, the bone of white. Let silence break before first light. Let not the tongue be tied in dread. With rooster's breath beneath thy bed. It's oddly charming, in a mildly unsettling way. But don't worry, it didn't always involve bones. In many regions, rooster feathers were considered just as effective and more portable. These were tucked under pillows, sewn into garments, or hidden in the lining of shoes. In some parts of Ireland, a person would slip a rooster feather under their mattress before an important conversation, especially if they feared confrontation. Speak like the cock, they'd whisper as a blessing. You step into the ruined garden now, the ground soft with forgotten paths. A low stone bench crumbles near an old apple tree, and something glints beneath the moss, metal, round, dull with age. You kneel and brush away the dirt. It's a charm disc, crude, etched with the outline of a rooster in mid-crow. Beneath it, just one word. Say. That's all. Not be brave. Not speak the truth. Just say that it might have belonged to a young woman, perhaps on the eve of declaring herself in a village courtship, or a boy dreading the morning when he'd recite scripture for the first time. Someone quiet, someone scared, someone hoping a feathered symbol could do what their own voice couldn't. You turn the disc in your hand, and for a moment, it feels warm, though that could just be the sun. Still, it's a moment. Not all dreams came from bones and feathers. Of course, some people swore that simply hearing a rooster while drifting into sleep would open the mind and strengthen the spirit. In these cases, families kept birds beneath the floorboards. Yes, under the bed. So their crowing at dawn would be the very first thing the sleeper heard. The practice was especially common in parts of the Pyrenees, where dreams were considered sacred messages. If the rooster crowed in the dream itself, even better. That meant courage had entered you. You'd wake up with the ability to say anything. Did it always work? No. Sometimes you just dreamed about soup. But belief was often more powerful than evidence. One folktale tells of a mute traveler who wandered the hills for 20 years, sleeping each night with a rooster bone tied around his wrist. One night, he dreamt of the birds speaking Latin. He awoke the next morning and whispered his own name aloud for the first time. Again, coincidence or hope wrapped in feathers? Does it matter? You walk now toward the edge of the field, the grass, long and waving in the wind. Somewhere beyond it, another rooster begins to crow, not frantically, but proudly. One clean, perfect call. You feel it in your ribs, not magic. Just memory. Just the thought that something once slept under a bed, clutching a bone, listening for that crow, and woke up braver. And maybe that's enough. The morning is warming now, gold spilling through the cracks in the canopy above like honey. Birds, other birds, have begun their usual chatter, but every now and then, a rooster breaks through the noise with a smug, deliberate caw. You smile without meaning to. He's still doing his job. Your boots crunch gently over a stone path worn thin by time. On either side, the ruins of a market square unfold. Stone stalls, a toppled fountain, crates now filled with soil and roots, instead of fish or flax. But carved into one of the fountain's old spouts, you spot something familiar, a tiny rooster, mid-strut. And here, in what once bustled with bargaining voices, you enter the world of amulets, tokens, and a medieval obsession with wearable confidence. The rise of the rooster amulet that you've probably worn a good luck charm at some point. A coin, a ring, a lucky sock. Some of us wear the same shirt for big meetings, and yes, we know it's superstition, and no, we're not going to stop. But back in the late Middle Ages, particularly from the 14th to 16th centuries, rooster-themed amulets became a quiet trend, especially for those who struggled to speak up. Why? Because if you couldn't be the rooster, you could at least wear one. Let's start with the most common form. The feather pouch, small leather bags, often no bigger than a walnut, containing a single rooster feather, usually red, sometimes white. These were worn around the neck or tied to belts. The belief was simple. The feather, if plucked from a rooster that crowed during a moment of bravery or celebration, still carried that energy. Wear it, and you'd borrow some of the bird's boldness. These pouches were sometimes blessed by village priests, but more often by local healers or herbalists. Some included herbs, bits of iron, or dried flowers, but the feather was the heart of it. Without it, it was just a bag. With it, an emotional battery. In fact, one old recipe book, mostly filled with turnip soups and dubious cures for gout, features a small section titled, "For the Tongue That Doth Tremble." The remedy? A pouch with rooster feather, dried rosemary, and a drop of candle wax dripped on a Wednesday. A little ritual. A little nonsense. But people swore by it. Historians still debate whether this practice was inspired by Christian iconography, older pagan beliefs, or just centuries of people wishing birds could loan out their self-esteem, but the amulets evolved. By the 15th century, carved rooster tokens began to appear. These were small, coin-sized, often made from bone, pewter, or wood. One side typically bore an image of a rooster in full crow. The other might have a word or phrase scratched into it. Things like "speak true," "fear not," or, in one particularly dramatic case, "peck before fleeing." People kept them in pockets, tied them to girdles, or tucked them into shoes before gatherings. Courting a sweetheart? Bring the rooster token. Preparing to argue your case before the village reeve? Keep it in your palm. Singing at the harvest? Fair. Well, obviously you needed at least two, one for each sock. You chuckle, imagining a tavern singer with both feet full of poultry power, crooning off-key into the wind. The tokens weren't always personal, either. Some were gifted. One touching tradition, seen in parts of Wales and Cornwall, involved carving a rooster token for a friend who'd been through a difficult time. The giver would present the amulet with a quiet phrase, "For when your words return." No pressure, just presence. You find one such token now, embedded in a cracked stone table near the edge of the market ruins. The carving is faint but intact. A rooster, wings lifted as if mid-flap, and the words say beneath it, the same word you saw etched into the garden disc earlier. A quiet echo through time. Rooster amulets made their way into courtship customs. 2. In parts of Eastern Europe, lovers exchanged miniature rooster pendants as tokens of honesty and affection. The boy would wear his beneath his shirt until he felt ready to declare his feelings. If the girl returned his affections, she would pin her own feather charm onto his cloak. Not subtle, but certainly heartfelt. And then there were the secret amulets. Some monks and clerics, not exactly encouraged to wear jewelry, would stitch rooster symbols into their robes. Tiny, near-invisible threadwork in cuffs or hems. A kind of whispered courage, always close, never visible, and still believed in. There's one diary entry from a nun in Rouen who writes, "Today I stitched the bird into my sleeve, that I might find the strength to speak plainly. It is foolish. It is working. You leave the market square now, the morning light brightening by the minute. You pass a low wall, where a child once scratched a rooster shape into the plaster and colored it with red ochre. No words, just the image. Even that, just the image, was enough, because the rooster wasn't just a bird in these tokens. It was a conversation between the shy and the brave, between who you were and who you wanted to be. And sometimes, all it took to cross that distance was a feather in your pocket. You pause at the edge of the path. A rooster crows in the distance, not sharp now, not insistent, just a single call, as if to say, you've still got time. You touch the smooth stone in your hand, the little token you found near the fountain, and close your fingers around it. Not because you need it, but because it reminds you that you've always had the voice. Even when you forgot where you put it, the morning is in full swing now. Not loud. Exactly. This isn't the roaring kind of daybreak, but it's no longer waiting for permission. You move along a cobbled path that curves downhill, lined with hedges still sparkling with dew. The world is alive again. Smoke from early hearths curls up through chimneys. Somewhere off to your left, a dog barks twice, then goes silent, as if remembering it's not supposed to be the first voice of the day. And then, as expected, a rooster crows. This one loud, confident, possibly a little smug. The kind of crow that says, I've survived theology, superstition, fashion accessories, and now it's breakfast time. But not everyone loved the sound. Not always, because there came a time, inevitably, when people decided they'd had enough. And so we arrive at church bands and chicken panic. Yes, it happened. Eventually, someone tried to shut the roosters up that you'd think the church would have loved the symbolism. Vigilance, redemption, dawn, all that. But somewhere between the 15th and 16th centuries, the line between reverence and superstition started to blur in a way that made certain bishops very uncomfortable. Let's set the scene. Picture a village where nearly every home has a rooster feather over the doorframe, amulets clinking against belt buckles, and children whispering bedtime prayers to the chicken under their bed. Now imagine being the local priest, trying to deliver a sermon about divine grace, while someone in the front row clutches a rooster bone and mutters, "Crow for me, brave one." Something had to give. In parts of France, particularly around Tours and Limoges, bishops issued guidelines against the glorification of barnyard beasts. These weren't blanket chicken bans. People still needed eggs, after all, but they did crack down on the use of roosters in spiritual rituals. Specifically, no more roosters in confessionals, no rooster bones under altars, no placing live roosters beside ill children to sing them brave. And absolutely no crowing-based matchmaking during Mass. One particularly irate bishop even wrote, "Let not the cock replace Christ in the hearts of the anxious. For though his cry was holy once, it is not meant for repetition by the foolish." Yikes, historians still debate whether these edicts were rooted in theological concern or just deep personal annoyance at being routinely upstaged by a bird. But the bans didn't stop there. Some towns began to enforce laws against the unlicensed keeping of sacred poultry. That's right. If your rooster was suspected of being used in spiritual or emotional rituals, you could be fined. In one village outside Prague, a woman named Marta was brought before the local council for allegedly staging illegal dawn blessings with her rooster, Pious Henri. The charge? Public disturbance of theological order. The punishment? A public apology and the requirement that Henri be confined to non-spiritual crowing. Whatever that means. And yet, as with all great suppressions, The belief didn't vanish that it just went underground. Rooster feathers were still stitched into garments, but inside cuffs or into linings. Amulets were worn beneath tunics, and bones were hidden behind family icons or tucked into pillows. Seems point one priest's private journal, never intended for public eyes, contains this confession. I have told the flock to banish the cock from their dreams. Yet I wear his feather in my boot, for I too tremble before the crowd. There it is, the truth pecking through. Even as the church pushed for spiritual purity, even as scholars rolled their eyes at paltry psychodrama, people still needed something to believe in when their voices shook, when their words stuck in their throats like dry bread, and the rooster, flawed, ridiculous, unapologetically loud, was still there. The crackdown had unintended consequences too. That in some areas, children were warned against believing in the rooster's power, not because it was silly, but because it might be dangerous. There was a brief period, particularly in parts of Bavaria, where rooster imagery was associated with whispered heresy. People began to panic. One anxious priest, clearly overwhelmed, wrote a pamphlet titled The Feathered Temptation on the Sin of Cockerel Idolatry. Yes, that's real. Or at least, real enough to be quoted by later clerics who found it hilarious. The panic didn't last long. By the 17th century, the rooster had been comfortably absorbed back into church decor, not as a talisman, but as a symbol. Weather vanes, carvings, metaphor, not magic. But the memory lingered. In rural villages, elders still whispered old rhymes. Children still drew roosters in the margins of their lessons when they were nervous about reciting aloud. And travelers still passed through towns where someone might offer you a feather just in case. And of course, there was the black feather ban. In one particularly eccentric corner of Wales, a local council once issued a warning against carrying black rooster feathers as courage charms, claiming it encouraged vanity and ungodly boldness in speech. In response, an unknown bard composed a mocking poem that was widely circulated in taverns. It ended, "Take my voice and take my shoe, but leave my feather, black and true, for in its spine my speech does grow, even when my tongue says no." You pass an old fence now, barely more than posts and wire. A single feather is tied to the top rail, faded to gray, its string frayed. Someone left it here, maybe recently, maybe years ago. You pause, then reach out, brushing it with your fingertips. The wind lifts it just slightly, enough to make it flutter, still tethered, but not still. Like all the old beliefs, they were never really banned. Just hushed and still. Somewhere, the rooster crows. Not because he's holy, but because that's what he does. And somehow, even now, we still listen. The sun is fully awake now, brushing the tops of the trees with streaks of molten gold. Birds chirp in a steady, confident rhythm. Smoke curls from cottage chimneys. A cart creaks along a distant road, its wooden wheels groaning like someone who's had just enough sleep to feel annoyed about being awake. You follow a narrow footpath through a field dotted with clover and buttercups, the ground soft underfoot, the air warm with promise. But despite the light, despite the calm, there's a faint shiver in the wind. A whisper. A story not quite done telling itself. Because now we've entered the shadowy edge of this feathery folklore. Tonight, well, this morning, we tiptoe into whispers of witchcraft and crowing curses. Yes, it was only a matter of time. Any creature that people love too much, fear too much, or ask too much of eventually gets tangled in accusations of magic. And the rooster, with its eerie internal clock and unsettling ability to scream into silence, was no exception. In several regions, especially during the height of European witch hysteria in the 16th and 17th centuries, roosters walked a precarious line between protector and suspect. At first, their role in ritual was seen as harmless, but then came the rumors. The claims that certain children, particularly quiet ones, had not simply grown shy, but had been cursed into silence. And the only way to break that silence? A rooster's crow. At midnight. Cue the ominous lute music. Let's start with Transylvania. Because, of course, Transylvania. One local legend tells of a girl named Annika who stopped speaking after wandering into a forest alone. Her parents tried everything: priests, healers, whispered prayers into bread dough, but nothing worked. Then, an old woman told them the cure. You must sit the child beside a white rooster in a circle of salt, under the moon, and wait for it to crow at midnight. If it does, the curse will break. If not, the silence is forever. These were not subtle times. The family did exactly that. The rooster crowed. The child sobbed and spoke her name. Whether it happened or not, the story spread like wildfire dipped in superstition. And just like that, the midnight crow became folklore gospel. In villages across Eastern Europe, families of shy or nonverbal children were encouraged to perform similar rituals. Some used salt circles, some used crosses made of chalk, others simply left the rooster in the child's bed overnight. There are reports, written in the jagged, anxious script of local officials, of rooster-themed exorcisms being performed in barns, root cellars, and occasionally the back rooms of taverns. Historians still debate whether these rituals were genuine belief, desperate parenting, or elaborate sleep-deprived theatrics. Probably all three. But not everyone saw the rooster as the solution. Some saw it as the cause. In parts of rural Scotland, rumors spread that witches used rooster feathers in curses, specifically to steal speech or bind the tongue of a rival. The idea was that if you plucked a feather from a rooster that had never crowed and tied it with horsehair beneath someone's bed, they would be unable to speak in public. This also assumes you had time, access to horsehair, and a cooperative non-crowing rooster, arguably rarer than a unicorn. One document from 1632 details the trial of a woman named Mairead who was accused of silencing a village midwife with the feathering charm. According to testimony, the midwife began stammering during a baptism and could not say the child's name. When her bed was later searched, they found a small charm under the mattress, a rooster feather, a bit of bark, and a scrap of linen marked with a spiral. Coincidence? The judges didn't think so. Mairead was sentenced to public penance and a month's isolation in the town millhouse. The rooster in question was confiscated and allegedly refused to crow ever again. Dramatic? Certainly, but powerful in a way that logic struggles to reach. In other stories, the color of the rooster mattered. White roosters were considered protective. Red roosters were passionate, impulsive, a little dangerous. Black roosters, though, that's where it got messy. Black roosters, especially those with red eyes or unusually aggressive behavior, were seen as omens, or worse, as familiars. It was said that witches could communicate through them, using their crows to send messages or curses. There's even a tale from Bohemia about a rooster that crowed backward. No one knows what that means. But the storyteller insisted that 3 villagers fainted and 1 child didn't speak again for a week. Of course, most of these tales are just that, tales. Fragments of fear dressed up in feathers. But there's something poignant hiding inside them. The idea that silence, especially in a child, was so feared that people had to name it, blame it, fix it. And if they couldn't, they created rituals, crowings, charms, whispered chants in candlelight. Not to banish evil, but to banish helplessness. Because it's hard to watch someone struggle to speak. And harder still to accept that sometimes there's no rooster-shaped cure. You reach the edge of the field now, where the grass thins and the land flattens. A small wooden post juts out of the ground. Tied to it, a strip of red cloth. A single black feather, left by someone. For someone. A prayer. A curse. A memory. No one knows. But just then, a rooster crows, not in panic. Not in warning. Just to be heard. And you hear it. You walk on, the wind soft behind you, the stories fluttering in your wake. The path ahead is wide and sun-dappled now, stretching gently toward the village you first passed hours, or maybe centuries ago. Birds chirp merrily, and somewhere nearby, a rooster gives a short, lazy crow, like it's only half interested in fulfilling its ancient obligations. You walk slower now. Not tired, just full. Your mind, once weighed down with the predictable burdens of modern thought, now carries a strange little museum of feathers, bones, poems, charms, and midnight poultry exorcisms. And you've begun to wonder, how did it all fade? When did the rooster stop being a confidence coach, a soul whisperer, a clucking therapist in the village square? That's what this part is for, why it faded, why it lingers. You see, no belief dies in a clean, dramatic swoop. It doesn't vanish with a royal decree or disappear the moment someone invents a wristwatch. Beliefs, especially the boring ones, the quiet ones, the chicken-based ones, don't die. They molt. They evolve. They get rebranded. Let's start with the obvious culprit, the Enlightenment. Ah yes, the age of reason, logic, science, observations. Men in powdered wigs declaring that if you couldn't dissect it, measure it, or name it in Latin, it probably didn't exist. A noble endeavor, to be sure, but not exactly a welcoming environment for rooster amulets and feather dreams. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, scholars began to roll their collective eyes at folk rituals. Physicians wrote handbooks dismissing feather charms as provincial curiosities. Theologians politely nudged the faithful away from rooster bone blessings. And if you dared bring a chicken to confession, well, you wouldn't be excommunicated, but you'd be remembered forever. As science advanced, so too did psychology. The 19th century brought Freud, the unconscious, and later, the idea that shyness was not caused by spirits or blocked throat chakras or lazy roosters, but by internal conflict, by trauma, by temperament, by mothers. Sorry, medieval chickens. You were replaced by couches and notebooks. Schools began teaching rhetoric. Public speaking became a skill, not a blessing. If you were shy, you didn't need a rooster. You needed a tutor, or Toastmasters, or therapy. The rituals faded. The tokens were lost. The feathers gathered dust. But they never fully disappeared. Because even now, the echoes remain. Ask any child who clutches a Lucky Charm before presenting at school. Ask the actor who wears the same socks on opening night. Ask the nervous groom who rehearses his vows into a mirror while picturing himself as a lion or a rooster. In some places, the belief lingers more literally. In rural Romania, there are still blessings performed with rooster feathers for children who struggle to speak. In parts of southern Italy, people still tie rooster feathers into crib sheets, not for volume, but for a brave heart. And in Germany, on certain holidays, it's still traditional to serve a rooster-shaped pastry called Mutkeks, courage cookies, to children beginning school. Eat the cookie, find your voice. Even language remembers. Think of the idioms. He's got no crow. She lost her voice. Speak your truth. Strut your stuff. Somewhere, under all that, is a feathered ghost whispering, remember me? Even pop culture nods to the tradition. There's a French children's cartoon in which a rooster mentors a shy rabbit through public speaking. A British sitcom features a running joke about the family rooster charm passed down for generations, each person swearing it gave them the guts to propose. Small things, but they add up, because belief never really vanishes. It just finds new nesting spots. One anthropologist, writing about the rooster's symbolic decay, said, "The bird was not dismissed. It was absorbed. Its crow became internal." In other words, we took what the rooster represented, vigilance, courage, unapologetic presence, and tried to become it. And sometimes, we still need a reminder. You pass a schoolyard now. Children laugh, shout, chase each other. One holds a plastic rooster toy in her hand, squeezing it so it squawks every few seconds. Another child covers his ears. A third grabs it, lifts it high, and shouts. He's not afraid of anything. The teacher rolls her eyes, but doesn't stop them. You smile. Because even here, even now, the rooster lives on. Not as a god, not as a therapist, but as a symbol of bravery, of voice, of being willing to speak, even when your throat tightens and your hands shake, of saying, "Here I am," even when it's easier to shrink. The beliefs faded, sure, but the need? Still very much alive. You walk on, the morning light strong now, painting everything in sleepy gold. You don't have feathers. You don't need them, but you do have a voice. And maybe, after all this, that's the only real magic the rooster ever offered. The road has come full circle now. You can see the village ahead, smoke lazily rising from chimneys, laundry flapping on lines like sleepy flags of peace. A few villagers mill about, speaking in the soft tones of early morning. Somewhere, a child giggles, a dog yawns, and, as expected, a rooster crows. Not with drama, not with prophecy, just because. It's what roosters do. And now, you reach the final steps of this curious, cobblestone journey through superstition, silence, and the strange medieval belief that a bird could cure your shyness. So let's walk this last stretch together, shall we? You pass the low stone wall where the carving still sits, that proud rooster, wings mid-flap, eternal in his scratchy confidence. You pause there, one hand resting on the cool, worn rock, and think about all the places you've been. The confessional booths with feathers tucked under the benches. The alchemists boiling hearts into potions of bravery. The monks hoping a crow would redeem their stammer. The taverns. The talismans. The bones under beds. So much noise in pursuit of voice. So many rituals invented by people who were, really, just like you. Just like us. Trying to find the courage to say something true. The story of the rooster isn't just about a belief that a bird could banish shyness. It's a story about people who needed help doing one of the hardest things in the world, being seen. Speaking up, letting themselves be heard. Whether they turned to feathers or charms or salt circles beneath the moon, what they were really saying was, please, just a little courage. Enough to get the words out. And somehow, the rooster answered, with a crow that broke the stillness. That filled the silence. That said, you can do this. I already did. You pass a garden now, half wild, full of buzzing bees and tangled herbs. A young girl kneels by a coop, scattering grain with sleepy precision. Inside the enclosure, a rooster flutters down from his perch and gives a soft, satisfied cluck. The girl smiles. There's no ritual here. No ceremony. Just a quiet moment between a human and a bird. But somewhere, in her mind, whether she knows it or not, he's still a symbol. Of steadiness. Of presence. Of the permission to make noise. Even today, the rooster stands tall atop churches and cathedrals, on weather vanes, watching the wind, carved into pulpits, painted into manuscripts, sung about in rhymes. Not because people still believe he can cure shyness, but because he reminds them that shyness isn't failure. It's just a pause, a quiet before the crow, and that maybe, when you're ready, your voice will return too. You reach the center of the village square, the same spot where, hours ago, you imagined traveling confidence peddlers shouting about crowing cures. The cobblestones are warm now beneath your feet. A bell chimes in the distance, and a rooster crows one final time. Not for you, not for ritual, not for courage. Just because he can. Because that's what he does. Because that's what you can do, too. Because silence is not forever. And all it takes is one small crow. The road fades behind you now, and so does the village. The crows grow softer, the wind calmer, the colors gentler. You're not walking anymore. You're drifting. Drifting through thoughts of feathers and firelight, soft cloisters and muddy courtyards. Drifting past candlelit rooms where monks stitched rooster feathers into sleeves. Past garden beds where bones whispered promises into dreams. Past all the places where silence once lingered, and voices rose like steam in the morning. You feel the weight of those stories not as burdens, but as blankets, layered gently over your shoulders. They don't ask anything of you. They're just there, keeping you company as the hush deepens. Even the rooster has grown quiet now. He's perched on the edge of your thoughts, wings folded, eyes half-lidded in the light of a sleepy sun. He doesn't crow. He doesn't need to. He's done his part. You've found your voice, or at least, you've remembered that you have one. And that's enough for now. So let the warmth of morning settle into your breath. Let the stillness stretch around you, soft and safe. Let the last crow fade, and let yourself fade too, into rest, into quiet, into sleep. And if you dream of feathers tonight, let them be gentle. Let them remind you that you are brave, even in silence. Especially in silence. Because when the time comes to speak again, you'll know how. And if not, there will always be another rooster, waiting, just beyond the hill.